Okay. I'll start off by saying I'm Peter Baldwin and I work for the Health and Safety Executive in the UK. And I'm here today purely talking as the chair of the WHWB in the UK. But I was asked to talk about COSHH Essentials, which is a UK online system for people to do COSHH assessments with relatively easy. It's aimed at small companies and people that aren't really familiar with COSHH. So what is COSHH? I'll start off with that. It's UK legislation that controls hazardous substances. And COSHH Essentials is an electronic version of this, which is being developed, like I say, for small companies or for relatively inexpert people, and it enables people to identify the exposure controls they should be using. And this is an overview of the way COSHH Essentials works, and a lot of what I'm going to be talking about here is in one of the references. But effectively, you look at the hazard of the inherent hazard of the substance by looking at its R phrase or its H phrase, H statement rather. And then they do an exposure potential assessment, and that looks at how much has been used, how it's been used, the temperature and the volatility for liquids, and how dusty something is. And then it does internally a generic risk assessment, which and then it comes out with control approach. And the control approach is basically a sheet of paper, 2 to 4 sides, and it's meant to be very easy for someone to have a look at. What it does, it looks at the H phrases or the H statements of the risk phrases, and then it puts them into a hazard group, A to E, A being the least dangerous and the least hazardous substance, and E being the carcinogens of and the mutagens and the asthmagens, and then you've got Bs, which are just below that. So, and if you have a look at this table at some stage, you'll see there's a concentration range. It gives you a rough idea of, in the third column, and that gives you a rough idea of the exposure levels or the workplace exposure limits that will be applied to that type of hazard. So it gives you a rough idea there of how that works, that hazard banding. On the next slide, it assesses the exposure potential. So all that, the online tool will ask you about the process. Are you weighing, for instance, and how much are you weighing? How often are you weighing it? And then it asks for solids. It's the dustiness. So it's a fine powder, which is fairly high dustiness, down to pellets, which is fairly low. And for liquids, it looks at the volatility and operating temperature to work out how much liquid vapor will escape into the air. And that just it assesses the exposure potential. And as I said, it's all on when you go to the website, it will ask you questions along these lines. It will ask these types of questions. You know, what's the process? What's the task? How much are you using, etc. This is the internal assessment it does, and this is a very complex looking diagram. So what you look at the big circle at the bottom, you start up in the right top quadrants, and it's the hazard group A, so that's low hazard stuff. And as you go around the circle, you've got hazard group B, C, D, and D's on the opposite side. And then you've got these L, M's, and H. That's low dustiness, medium dustiness, and high dustiness. And that will then take you down into an inner circle. And you can see there's 3 inner circles. The inner one is for low amounts being used, and the outer one is for high amounts being used. So using you just by looking at how dusty the substance is, how much you're using, and its hazard group, you can come down to a number, and the numbers in the portal in the circle in the various segments, they define the control approach, which we'll talk about more in the next slide. You might notice there's if you go look at the very top, it's got hazard group E, and it's control approach 4, And I'm sure you'll all be glad to hear that the control approach 4 means you can't use this assessment because this assessment tool, because it's too hazardous for using this and getting a specialist to come in. These are the control approaches. If you remember, I said on the previous slide, you've got those numbers 1 to 4. Well, control approach 1 equates to general ventilation. So there's not much needed, shall we say, in the way of engineering controls, etc., etc. And if you go to control approach 2, it's an engineering control, and they expect there to be a 10-fold reduction in the exposure from using that engineering control. And it gives you some examples on the far right column about what an engineering control will look like. You see, like control approach 3 is containment, and that's a 100-fold reduction. And you do talk about stuff like glove boxes and that type of system. And as I said, number 4 special, and you need to get an expert in. What you end up being generated is the control sheets, and as I said, this is the one on the left is the way they look. It's about 2 to 4 sides of A4, and it takes you through the engineering control, shows you a picture of what it should look like, how you maintain it, etc., etc., and the management side and what else you need to do. And in certain instances, they might turn around and say you need to do health surveillance, and you get a sheet on health surveillance, etc., etc. Now you can go through the online system, and it would bring up to these control sheets. Or if you're lucky and you're working on an industry where we've got a set of sheets already available, and these are shown on the right-hand side. It says direct advice sheets, and we got them for agriculture, manufacturing, quarries, stonemasons, service and retail. So you can just click straight on those and go down to the relevant ones. I often find that if I'm going to do a rough assessment, I can go into those direct advice sheets and find one that's very similar to the problem that's facing me, and just do those as a starter for 10. And these control sheets are obviously very conservative in their approach and aimed at a layman. So in theory, someone, a factory owner or a small or micro enterprise can look at these and see what they're meant to be doing, and what the control system should look like. This is an example of how it might be used. And I must say, I want to say thanks to Mike Slater, the previous chair of WHWB, for this. And what this is, it's an example of mixing cerium oxide powder into a slurry. Now, this is a fine powder which they use to polish lenses. And in itself, it's not hazardous. It has no H statements or R phrases associated with it. So it's just a general dust. So you're using about 2 kilograms each time you're mixing these slurries up. And it's very high dustiness because it's a very fine powder. And you're doing this about 6 times a day. And then, so what's the control approach? This is that circle put into a tabular format. So you've got a medium amount being used in hazard group A because it has no risk statements or H statements or R phrases. So it's hazard group A, which is low hazard dust. Medium amount being used, high dustiness, and that's control approach 2. And if you remember from the previous slide, that's engineering controls, LEV, etc., etc. And it will come down with some sheets that are applicable to this particular task. And as you can see, the ones it's pulled up from the process is local exhaust ventilation or a laminar flow booth. You have to consider which one you want to use. And also there's a task of weighing. So you can have a look at these sheets and it will help you decide what controls you need for that particular process, which is weighing 2 kilograms of this fine powder 6 times a day. There are some limitations to this tool. As I said earlier on, it's very conservative. And you can't apply it if you're using a mixture of solids and liquids because controls are basically different. and it doesn't consider process-generated hazards. However, if you go onto the HSE website for specific guidance on process-generated hazards, they'll give you some guidance on there. And if you go on to the next slide, this is the final one. There's some reference in there. The first one is the index to COSHH Essentials. And if you go on there, it will take you through the entire process. It's fairly easy to use. As I say, it's aimed at a non-expert. And the bottom reference there is the technical basis for this process. It's worth a read, but for the average person that's using this, they don't need to know that. They just need to get these control sheets.